Hi everyone. We will get going. Today we are doing our third meeting. Hi everyone. Just checking in that first of all that the sound is working. We are kicking off our third meeting, and we may be having some issues with our mic. So Katie, I'm not sure if you had tried to go, but we were not able to hear you. So I'm going to go ahead and get us going. As you know, this is our third meeting, so we'll just go ahead and do a little overview on how the technology works again. Katie, if you are on, do you want to walk us through? All right, so just as a reminder, if you want to be unmuted, use the hand raise tool. I know it's a little blurry there, but there's a little spot where you click hand raise, and that way we can unmute you and hear you on our system. There's also a chat box that's lower. Either you can use the questions or the chat box, and there'll be an opportunity if you don't want to take yourself off mute to just type in responses. So we will get going today here. Our agenda today is to, first of all, cover the ESSA regulations that have been released about 2 weeks ago. And then we want to just move from there into what's required to meeting the minimum for this part of the law, and can you do it? We also said we would touch base on how salaries are going to play into this down to the school level. And lastly, we will give you a little data inventory update and talk through our office hours, which is the last half hour of the hour-and-a-half portion of the session. And that is completely optional. You can stay on or log off depending on what you choose. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. As far as the ESSA discussion, we mentioned at our last meeting that some regulations had been released. Those regulations are final. We've given a link to you in a slide in here just in a moment. But what we did find was that there is additional guidance to come. And we've heard, and we had a conversation with folks at the Department of Ed, and they said likely there'll be a guidance book coming in January, and then maybe even additional guidance coming later. But just wanted to let you know that just because the regulations are out doesn't mean that there's not more information coming. And so we draw attention here to some of the relevant highlights in the regulation update. First of all, there is an updated deadline. The deadline is June 30th, 2019, and what had been the deadline was December 30th, 2018 for the previous school year, and that's been extended. And I think that you can apply for that extension and then have that extension sort of permanently to June, and we're still getting some clarification on that. So that allows states a little more time to get their financials in order and report them. Another an update that we had predicted is that while it asked that the expenditures be broken out by federal, state, and local, they have grouped those as federal and state and local. So there's no need to parse the difference between state and local. That can be one category. Also, you, as you likely know, it asks for the actual personnel costs and then says parentheses including salaries. So we have a question whether this means benefits too. We're assuming it does because including salaries means something else, and the only other part of actual personnel costs is benefits. But we have that question submitted for clarification, and we'll do a little discussion today about how that can play out. All right, great. Next, there is some listing of what's excluded and what's included. On the excluded list is community services, capital outlay, debt services, and privately generated funds, including privately generated funds for pre-K and things like that. So on the included, excuse my typo, but not limited to expenditures list is administration, instruction, instructional support, student support services, pupil transportation services, operation and maintenance of plant, fixed charges. We're not really sure what fixed charges are, but it says fixed charges, preschool, and that means publicly funded portions, and net expenditures to cover deficits for food services and student body activities. So in other words, if you are taking money in for food services, as many school districts do, but using some additional public funds to cover the difference, the net is really is what they're looking for. And the denominator, because the ESSA regulation requires, you know, the per pupil expenditures. So the numerator is the expenditures, the denominator is the pupils. And a revision is that the student count is on or around, and the or around is added October 1st. And so the SEAs don't have to do that actual date. If there's some other date or something going on, they're able to use the other date. A lot of you have asked whether or not the student count can be weighted, and the answer is no, it's not weighted. And then there's been some questions about pre-K, and it says it includes pre-K students receiving free services. So we have a question submitted about students that are receiving partially free services, and I know that includes many of you, and we don't have an answer for that yet. So that's where we are on some of those. A little bit more here we just thought we would share, which is that there's a numerator and denominator that constantly get referred to. The numerator is the expenditures, right? The total dollars spent to operate a school minus things like community services, capital outlay, debt service. The denominator is, when they're talking about the denominator, they are meaning the student counts, the unweighted student count on or around October 1st of the fiscal year, and that includes pre-K students receiving free services. So hopefully that's just some language setting, a little bit of an update on the regulations. We found that there are still some questions out there, and even after the regulations have been submitted, there is, and we'll try to work to get some of those answers, and they may come in the form of guidance, or they may be things that states can just decide themselves. I see there are some questions, and let's see.
So Katie has an update.
How do we get a copy of the PowerPoints? How do we get a copy of the PowerPoints? Let's see. Katie, do you want to share with that how that works? So Katie, you may be talking. We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. So one thing I just wanted to clarify that you covered on the slide about 2 slides back was the June 30th deadline, and there's actually no protocol for applying for that extension. That is just the new deadline. So before, when it was December, now it's just June. So you don't have to apply for that, but there is an application process if states don't feel like they can meet that June 30th deadline. There's a 1-year extension that you can apply for, that states can apply for, that would then grant them the ability to meet the deadline by June 30th, 2020. So just to clarify that quick point. And Jennifer did ask a question about the slides being available, and we will post those on the Edunomics Lab Financial Transparency Working Group website as soon as the call is over.
Excellent. Any other questions or comments so far?
And if you have questions that you want to ask, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you, and you can ask verbally, or you can use the question box to send them to the group.
Or I think there are 2 boxes, the question or the chat. I'm not sure if they're different or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the participants can see the chat box.
Okay, all right. So either way, the questions or the box should be there. So one other thing that is in the ESSA regulation update is a mention of uniform procedures. So what it says is that a state must develop a single statewide procedure to calculate LEA current expenditures per pupil and a single statewide procedure to calculate school level current expenditures per pupil. So we had some questions regarding the procedure and what that means, and submitted those, and I think there may be a definition coming around what a procedure is. Right now, it sounds like it's fairly open, and the procedure could just be a means of how school districts should attribute shared services, things like HR, so on like that, or whether or not there are certain things that must be shared services, and so on. So we don't know yet. We'll find out, and we will report back. We have the link, which will be in the PowerPoint slides that are posted, and you can see that it's a very long link, but this is the link to the regulations that cover all the regulations on ESSA. And page 360, you're welcome to read the whole thing, but that's where this portion is on the financial regulations. So what we thought we would do is kind of just jump into looking at when there's this bare minimum data that you have to report, how close are you to being able to report it. A lot of what we've talked about with this group is how to build a system that taps into this data and does so in a way that can help your state build a system that provides more value to schools, that can be a school improvement tool. And that can be an additional amount of data, but of course there's this bare minimum, what do we have to report part of this. And so we thought we would look at that bare minimum part of this for a while. So if we were to think about meeting the basic requirement, we just brought a table. It's all made up data, made up names, made up school districts. But you can see the first blue band might be central school district, and there would be some school level data that would be broken out federal and state and local, and then a total given, and these are all on per pupil amounts. There would be some numbers that would be LEA level numbers, which you can see are $421 for Maple Elementary. There might be a state local share to the LEA shared services as well, with some kind of grand total. We don't know yet, and this is another question that we have, whether that each school's listing of the funds also needs to show their share of the LEA level dollars, but as you can see here, we showed those as being the same across the different schools and the same for the LEA average. They could be, conceivably different if you imagine that the LEA might have some shared services that are for high schools only or for special ed students only, but we show them as being consistent here for now, just to kind of get people a sense of what's going on. And what you can see is that we called it Charterama over to the right there, that many charters are in LEA, and so they would maybe be reporting the same numbers for their school level and might not have an LEA component because the money all goes to the school, which is the LEA. So we put this up as a discussion point, and we have a prompt for you, which is, if this data were available in your state, what questions would stakeholders ask if this was all that was provided? And you can use the chat or the question box to respond or raise your hand, and we can take you off mute. But we thought this might be a good place to start. As you can see, that Central District has a smaller number for its LEA expenses. Valley District has a higher number. Schools might have higher or lower share of the state and local dollars per pupil, yielding different totals across different schools, even inside a district. And we thought we would see what you all thought about if you were to be looking at this data for the first time. So there's a question box where you can type questions in, or we can take you off mute if you need.
So we do have one comment here. Should student counts be included in the chart?
Great question. I actually, right before this, was saying, I wonder if I should add a row for that. Student counts are already available as part of the report cards, and so I know you have that. those data, and it seems like it would be something you really would want to have right alongside your financials, right? Because you might see higher expenditures on very, very small schools, and that would be part of an explanatory feature. I think yes. I mean, I almost added it here. I just didn't want to give you too much when you were talking about meeting the basic requirement. But you need the student counts to make these calculations. The student counts are already part of your the report cards for each, with the information for each school, and could be really helpful here, particularly if you were looking at maybe one school was a very high special ed school, showing the numbers even broken out by students receiving different types of services would be helpful here. So I tend to agree with you that more information is better, and would instinctively want to put that on. I almost put it on here, just didn't want to give you too much to look at all at once.
Great. An initial question here: why does the charter school have a larger per pupil expenditure amount?
That's a good question. You know, these, as I mentioned, are made up numbers. The charter school has more than the green school, right? But less than any of the schools in the central district if you're looking at the grand total. What you see is nothing at the LEA level. So that means that the charter school, if it's its own LEA, is doing its own HR, its own finances, it's paying for its own facilities, its own security, its own data management, and in fact may be paying a fee to a CMO or an operator that runs the charters to do some of this. But generally, if a charter school is an LEA, and certain states this is how it works, then the charter school gets the full dollar amount or close to it that the students do in individual schools. And you'll see that across the bottom there, the grand total, that the charter might be getting $12,000 something, which is close-ish to some of these other school amounts, and it just is accounting for it all at the school level, whereas some of these other schools are receiving some of those same services from its LEA. I don't know if that help answers that question. But certainly some of these other schools will say, you know, if you're Maple Elementary, you might turn and ask your district, why do you keep $4,500 per student? And the district will say, well, we do the HR, we do the finances, we pass the budget, we also have our legal services for you, we have superintendent salary and a department that does professional development for you. We do some student identification and other things that we hope, including transportation and so on, that we hope you find a value, and that's where that $4,500 something goes toward. And I think it would probably be a good thing if Maple Elementary knew that amount and might have a conversation with the LEA about it. As I mentioned earlier, I don't know that that box under Maple Elementary will have to show that number, or it may only be required under the LEA average. So they would maybe have to look over to the LEA to find the rest of their share of the funds.
So we have quite a few more questions here. Sticking on the theme of charter schools are more likely to have private funding, and these amounts will not be reflected, correct?
That's correct. The private funding won't be there for the public district schools, nor will it be there for the public charter schools. And some charter schools do get a lot of private funding, some do not. That won't be on there, and that's certainly something a state could sort of choose to add in as a separate category if you wanted. It's also very hard to track, not just for charters, but it's hard to track for district schools, and because a lot of it is off books. Sometimes people donate computers and there's no accounting for the school district of money coming in. Sometimes things get donated that school districts or charter schools don't necessarily want or need, like money for, you know, who knows what. So the private money is going to be a thing that will have to handled at the state level for each separate state. And as you may or may not know, I mean, this might be a nice time to take stock of that. Some people will assume that the private donations are dwarfing the public expenditures. Generally, those numbers are quite a bit smaller than the 14,000, 13,000 per pupil figures you see here. But again, those patterns will vary geographically and by charter school type and so on. So you want to be able to find those if they think they're relevant in your state.
So another question here, why do schools across the same district receive different amounts of state and local funds?
That's a great question. I think that would be a question that stakeholders will be asking. And I think in this case, where you and your procedures for reporting can give them more information, I think that, you know, the stakeholders will understand it better. So some might be because they have higher, some might be because they have higher amounts of special ed students, which I think we've already talked about. Some might be, you know, they'll be asking about, well, is a smaller school entitled to more funds? They might be getting more funds if they're smaller. They might have higher salaries. These are all variables that the stakeholders will likely be asking. The more that a system, whether it's the report cards or a different system, can help people answer those questions, I think the more people will trust the data and use it of value. So I think those are the kinds of questions exactly that stakeholders are going to be asking.
I have one other one here right now. It says, are the numbers based on resident population or attending population? Is the student population listed elsewhere in the report, resident or attending?
Yeah, I think you'll want to make sure to indicate that the per pupils that will go into your numbers will have to be those who are enrolled in the schools. And but if a student is in your district but leaves and goes to a charter, that can't be counted as part of your enrollment. So so in some places, like I think in Massachusetts, where the school district receives funding, extra funding for students who leave and go to charters, it'll look more expensive because the denominator will only be the pupils that are attending the school district. So those will be some of the questions I think that certainly stakeholders will be asking.
Okay. And one more. Does the grand total per pupil include all expenditures per pupil or only a limited group of expenditures?
Excellent. That's kind of that question that we had before. I think people will be asking that. But if you look backwards, and I'll go back a little, it will be the total dollars to operate less certain categories. So the numerator here, minus community services, minus private money, people will be asking about that, minus capital outlay and debt services. So, you know, sometimes there are things that school districts do that are like adult services, and that will be subtracted out. Sometimes there are things that school districts do that, you know, really kind of a gray area. And I would say that from digging through school districts' budgets a lot, there are a lot of these gray areas that pop up. For instance, sometimes a school district provides security on an empty building that the school district still, you know, is responsible for. And so it doesn't really feel like an education cost, but it'll be in there. And so I think school districts themselves may want to have some place where they can add a little more color to their expenditures and help people understand those, because those questions are going to come up.
And related to that, what about schools that provide education for pupils from another LEA who attend on a tuition basis?
Yes, these are the kinds of questions that I think the state will come up with its procedure. Those students will attend and be part of the denominator, and the public funds that come with them on a tuition basis will be public funds from the other school district, and those will be included in the numerator. I anticipate that's how that would be handled, but I think there may be additional guidance on that, and I do think that states will have some way of kind of deciding how to count those funds in the numerator. The students definitely count in the denominator.
These are all great. There's one more here I think that we want to tackle perhaps before moving on. It says to say that when a student moves to a new district or charter, it can't be absolute. It should be reported based on a time in the district. If they are 100 days in a school, then they count for that school. If they're spread over 5 schools, they won't be counted. We need rules guidance.
I think you're right. This is a really great point, but not one that I think that the current guidance has is going to give you an answer that you love on this one, because the current guidance gives this kind of October count, and there are cases where students leave in November and go to another school district. So the second school district they attend doesn't have any way of capturing them in their quote-unquote October count, but their expenditures are essentially captured here in the numerator. And so I think there's a kind of minimal way that the Department of Ed is saying that we have to report this. It doesn't mean it's the only way you have to report it. You can add additional data that shows, number of students that came after the October count, and sort of clarify that for the users. But I know right now a lot of states are changing the way they count students for those exact reasons. And I'm with you. I think that someday we'll get to a place where each school district owns a student for their portion a year and gets the expenditures for their portion of the year, and maybe those student outcomes are attributed back to them for their portion of the year. But that, I don't know that the field is quite there yet, but this might be something we'll get additional guidance on in the January guidance report, because I suspect that will be a big issue for some. But I think these are also awesome questions, because I think you all will, these are just a list of the questions that are going to hit you all when you come out with data like this, and you want to be thinking about them ahead of time. Otherwise you might have a whole lot of sort of misinformation circulating, or limited information, or enough skepticism about the data that you don't get the positive effects of people having a conversation about that. But like the kinds of questions that were asked about the charters are certainly going to come up. The kinds of questions about why are schools getting different money are certainly going to come up, and you'll want to be able to both have answers at the SEA level, but districts are going to field a lot of those questions, and those are the districts on the call are going to need to know how we're going to have our conversations, how we're going to educate our boards, how we're going to educate our principals on this, and how can we change these conversations into a way that yields maybe potentially a more productive conversation. Any other questions or comments on this before we move into a little bit of the salary discussion?
This is Katie Marguerite. I just wanted to say that I'm keeping track of all these questions, and I will post the list of questions when we post the slide as well.
Excellent. And I think that that's helpful, because the questions are things, ones you asked are similar to the ones we had sort of put up here as a placeholder. Why does one school get more money than another? How does my school compare to others? How are the expenditures broken down by program? So it would be nice for many of them to know how much of that money is actually in special education. What is the district level money? What's it used for? Why is there so much there? I think initial reaction will be surprised about those numbers. And then just generally speaking, is that a lot or a little, and how does it compare, and why are there differences in different places? So I think these figures will go a long way to sort of helping people understand this. And our next one is a task for you. Of course, it's optional. Everything in here is optional, but to see if you could pick an LEA, select maybe 2 schools within that LEA, and see how far you could go to completing this chart and what you find. And this is just sort of a way to figure out where there are holes in your system. We're working with many of you on the data inventory, but somehow putting concrete numbers into boxes like this can be eye-opening for everybody, both in terms of understanding what data you do have and what you don't have, and sort of getting a handle on what kind of numbers you're going to pull up. So we have this blank chart here, and we're hoping that you will, or someone on your team will take it. If you're a school district, you could do it on 2 of your schools. If you are a SEA, you can pick a school district and maybe do it with them. Maybe if you have a partner school district, you can pick the same one and see if you pull out the same numbers or not. And you'll see all the questions that it surfaces about what to include, what to not to include, what to divide by, and so on. You can post your results or just questions or comments on our blog there, and that way we can start to understand what you're doing on your end and what questions have surfaced, where there are holes. I mean, it's fine to just say we don't yet have this information at all. All we could do is fill out the lowest right-hand box for the LEA averages there, and that's all we have. Or we can pull an old budget likely and get the federal, state, and local totals, but not be able to break them out by school or LEA. So that's just a task if you're interested to kind of work on that and work with the group through what we find and so on. Any questions or comments on that? Okay, excellent. Let's move on to our next topic, which is about salaries and benefits. And we brought some data from some work that we've done together with Delaware. And so the Delaware data shows us a little bit about what patterns we're finding in salaries and benefits, or well, actually salaries. We didn't bring the benefits. We'll tell you a little bit about what we know, and how those are not always the same across all districts, and can create some variation there. So one of the salary differences that you'll find is one of the differences you'll find in spending across schools will be attributed to salary difference, and for many this will be kind of a scary thing to be posting, and may create some inequities that make people or different equity groups uncomfortable, particularly if those salary differences tend to favor certain types of schools. And we found in the past that can be the case. It's not always the case, but it can be the case. So we brought some data from Delaware, and first we're going to show you how the average salary can vary across districts. And the salary schedule, it doesn't always give you a sense of that, because you look at a salary schedule and you assume that Delaware is a place where there is a statewide salary schedule. That because we have a statewide salary schedule, that salaries would on average be pretty equal across districts. But that's actually not the case. That you can see that some of the schools some of the school districts must have on average more experienced teachers or teachers with greater graduate degrees, because they're at the higher ends of these salaries. Some have access to teachers who are only on the lower end, and so will have less than the statewide norm, including those in the charter schools in Delaware. So I'll do one or two more slides, and then do we have David on the phone? Okay, great. So we can make sure to unmute him so that you can chime in at any time, but he can give you a sense of how it works in Delaware. But the statewide salary schedule also creates variations in salaries within districts. So this is the Christina School District, which is an urban district in Delaware, and you can see that there are some schools on the real low end, which are at about $47,000 per teacher, all the way up to $70,000. And so there are a lot of schools that are kind of hovering around the average, but a few on these very, sort of peaks and valleys, and that will affect the spending level, the per pupil spending level of those schools. And it might be an analysis that if you are as LEA, may want to go ahead and do for your district, so you can kind of get a sense of which schools are on the low end side. You can look at the average salaries for the teachers in your highest poverty quartile or your highest minority quartile, or break it out by elementary and high school and kind of get a sense of that to see what it would show. But we brought one more district to show you just how different the patterns are. This is Brandywine, and really the salaries across the entire schools across the entire district are really much closer to that average, with the highest and lowest ones only deviating by at most 10% from the average. And I think that's actually common, but it's also can be common to have a district with a lot of variation in student populations where you then see a greater spread. So it's definitely worth looking because it's something that will pop up in these, and I want to make sure that I've given a chance for David to offer some color on all of this.
Thanks, Marguerite. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
So yeah, a couple of points. I think it's important to note, if you go back to Christina is a district that has a significantly high number of high-need schools in the city of Wilmington, and then a suburban district that is not even contiguous to it. So unsurprisingly, the schools at the lowest end of the average salaries are some of the highest need schools in the Christina School District. When you get to the other end of the scale, you're looking at much lower suburban elementary schools, for the most part, around the University of Delaware. So what you see there, because the Christina School District has a scale based on experience and degree level that mirrors the state scale even on the local share, what you see is, unsurprisingly, lower salaries in the highest need schools, generally because they are hiring inexperienced teachers at a lower point in their education level, who then migrate to lower need suburban schools as they get the opportunity to, either through transfer rights and contract or just natural experience. So what you see is, even with a consistent salary scale, you see behavior that kind of creates equity gaps across the two main portions of the district. If you go to Brandywine on the next slide, Brandywine is a contiguous district who's chosen through its feeder patterns to maintain more of an emphasis on a balanced demographic within their buildings. It's a long way from perfect, but you see much less of an impact as a result of that. In fact, the highest need school in Brandywine is Holland Elementary, which is basically at the district average, which I think would probably point to the fact that there's probably leadership in that building that's able to retain faculty within the school, despite the fact that transfer rights exist to allow those teachers to move to lower need schools. So you see, in some ways, I think this is as much a reflection of the demographic characteristics of the schools within two different districts, and the choices those districts either have had to make because of the nature of their geography, or have chosen to make because of board policy around feeder patterns and demographic balance.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I wonder, because there will be places that will show potentially even starker patterns, and then some that won't. You know, we've seen the whole range. I would say that whenever there is a district with big differences in income within the district, it's often an urban area. You know, you have like kind of a wealthy side of a district and a low-income side of a district, or that's when you see some of the biggest disparity in salaries, but not always. And like you mentioned, there are districts that are working hard on this, and there are districts that are controlling their own salaries and potentially offering greater pay to work in certain schools, or reducing the portion of the salary that's tied to experience or master's degrees, and trying to tie more of it to things that teachers could earn all over the district. And so then they end up with different patterns. Some are saying, you know, offering greater money if you work in a low-income school or things like that. But David, do you want to just give like a 1 minute sort of sense of how, because Delaware's looked at this data for some time now, how people are thinking about moving forward and whether or not you've gotten pushback from different groups on the current model?
Yes, if I can do that in a minute, I'll try.
You can take it more time.
Yeah, we have a basic funding system that's about 80 years old that is based primarily on the right to hire positions as opposed to the allocation of dollars to schools. So we have a system that's a combination of position entitlement with a state salary scale. So to Marguerite's earlier point, it's interesting when you still manage to see some fairly significant anomalies across districts, which could be differences in local poverty wealth in terms of the ability of low wealth districts to maintain a competitive local share of a salary scale to a district like Brandywine, which has more wealth behind each student. There are pros and cons of a position-based system. Delaware is one of only 6 nationally that still has one. One of the strengths for decision makers at the LEA level, like CFOs and superintendents, is it gives them a tremendous amount of certainty and control, but it gives principals very little discretion over budgets. They may get to choose who they hire, but it's not based on the salary that teacher is going to earn, which may be a strength or maybe not. But on the flip side, there is very little flexibility in the system because all of the money is going through the salary scale that's prescribed at the state level. So the decisions that individual principals have tend to be very, very limited. At the district level, district may have more control, and I think that's reflected in the data that Marguerite's showing. But we have had several attempts to move much more towards a weighted student funding system with dollars following students and schools as opposed to positions. And that is met with very, very significant resistance from stakeholders in the system.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Is that as Delaware is a great example. The data do surface some questions, and they may prompt people to say, are we allocating our money in the right way? Should we keep the salary schedule? Do we want district level leaders negotiating these things? Do we not want district level negotiating these things? Are we worried about the patterns, or are we not? And as you point out, there's not a uniformity in the response. So some are resistant to changing, some are eager to change it, and those are all the kinds of things that may come out of having these data public. So it'll likely be a wild ride, but I think that's a perfect example of that. Any other questions or comments about that?
We do have one question here. It would be helpful to have the context of how many teachers are in the building. And I'm thinking if that's more about a data display and data sharing, or if it's just within the context of our actual conversation.
Yeah, I think the instinct that you have to look at data and want more data is going to be one also that we're going to see at every step in this process. So I do know that there'll be times when you all will be trying to create these data systems and people will say, well, what we should have is, and then add another data element. 2 things I want to point out, which is that the need for more data to understand the data we have could be infinite, and so at a certain point that will become at odds with this goal of making the data simple. And it does say in the regulations and the law that the data needs to be simple, transparent, easily consumed, and people do get buried almost in too many numbers. So I think in some ways that if there is a simple way to sort of report data, and then a deeper kind of system where people can go tap into other numbers. They'll say, like, can I understand this data if I just look at the special ed piece? Or can I understand this data if I just look at how many teachers are there? Can I look at this data, have the sense? And often those questions are just a way to kind of gain confidence in the data more than anything else, because the extra data we often provide doesn't always explain everything. So that's going to be part of this as well. But I think the kinds of questions you all will be asking each other will be the very exact same ones that people will ask you, and they may or may not help explain it, but they also might help people get confidence in it. At the same time, they could just make the whole thing more complicated. So I think we'll see a lot of that, but just a flag for that point as well.
And another quick question, how do administrative and support salaries figure into this analysis that was done, or are we just looking at teachers?
That's a great question. So this particular analysis looked at all, I think, instructional personnel. I have to remember that. I don't want to go too far and say that I remember exactly, but I think we looked at all instructional personnel.
Looking at the numbers, Margarita, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And secondly, I think that there are times when by the time you add in principals, it magnifies the pattern. There are times when the principal salaries might be more level, so they might kind of mute the patterns a little bit across places. You might sometimes where you put in other non-certificated staff, including paraprofessionals or food service workers and so on, and it magnifies the patterns even more because those might be on longevity-based pay schemes as well, or there are times when their salary schedules are flatter and they mute them. So the law says that you do have to capture the real salaries of the people who work in the building. So those who are principals and things like that will be factored into your analysis, and I can't say how those patterns will play out everywhere. It's one of those things where you have to look at your data and see what happens. But yeah, the context here, I think, was the certificated instructional personnel at the schools. It shouldn't be hard data to pull, at least on one place. I mean, it's payroll data. So it's a way for you to kind of grab it. Usually it's digital, it's easily accessible, and you can pull it and start to take a look at your patterns. And I would encourage individual LEAs to start taking a look at that, and SEAs to, if you have data handy, start running some patterns on that to see how it's playing out. All right, great. Well, I did want to just make at least a quick mention. We decided we didn't have as much time to go into the benefits part of this as we had hoped. But normally we see benefits as adding another 20 to 30% load on salaries. And there are many ways that you can attribute, not many, there's a couple ways you can attribute your health and benefits costs. You can do it formulaically. So there's some sort of formula that shows sort of what the benefits load is on each employee and attribute your cost that way. Or you can, some places actually do have the actual dollars attached for benefits attached to each employee, and those can be parsed out that way. So we see data sets do it both ways, but what we normally see is that the benefits, for health can be flatter generally, but pension benefits can cause more variation. And there are a lot of questions when it comes to attributing pension costs, and we're not sure yet because we don't have that additional guidance from the Department of Ed of how this will play out. But we can. It's usually not hard to attribute the employer share of a pension, the pension cost. So sometimes the employer puts in 7% of the employee's salary into the pension fund, and that obviously, as you can imagine, is pretty easy. We find that can adjust the salaries, the actual per pupil costs up about $400 per pupil or less. So that's what you're looking at for the numbers of those all in for all the different pensions. But attributing the total pension cost is not easy, and that's because often the state or the district is making a pension payment that's in excess of what they're paying in per employee. That may be because they haven't paid enough in over the past or whatever. And there is a big pot of money that's not really attributed to any employee or to any school. And the payment may be made directly by the district, or it may be made directly by the state. And there are some states that do that. So that is going to be one of those questions that we'll have, where it may be the case that it's up to the state whether that portion of the money is in or out. It may be the case that it's just going to get divided out across all the districts, or set aside for some other amount. I don't know for sure. But that total pension cost attribution is not easy, and I don't have any simple answers for that. So sometimes, districts are paying pension costs for teachers who no longer work there. So it's one of those questions about, is there a way to attribute that to the education of the students who are there, given those costs don't really benefit those students in any way? So that I would say is still an open question, and we hopefully will have more on it. So that was a big section where I just gave you more questions than answers, and I'm sorry about that. All right, so I'll let you know where we are now. We have office hours for the next half hour today, and those are office hours around this issue of data inventory, but you can stay on and ask other questions as well. And those are just optional. If you have things to talk about as you've been doing your data inventory, stay on the call. We'll be here and able to answer your questions if we can. We will unmute all the participants to allow for a more involved question if you want to stay on for that. There's also an office hours period for the December 19th meeting. We decided with so many erratic schedules that week that we would make it an all office hour meeting. You can join if you like, and we can just go over data that you have, or questions that you have about your data inventory, or unique questions for your state. Please email Katie if you can, if your SEA plans to attend. Either way, we'll be on there and you can join in. And if neither date works for you, but you do have you'd like to set up a call, email Katie and we'll make sure to set aside a separate call and we can talk through things. Also notice that there's an opportunity to interact with us on their data inventory by using the online option. You just click onto that blog, and there's actually a space on the blog that you can upload your own data or questions or comments as well. And so we'll be watching that carefully to do that. Katie, did I cover all of that?
Yep, that's perfect. I will also post on the blog in the same style that we posted the data inventory, the chart that Marguerite referenced, if folks want to start working on that over the next few weeks. And we can also discuss that during office hours next week as well. So if you have any questions or want to join to talk through either of those kind of activities, we will be there.
Great, and just a flag that our next meeting is December 19th. It's just an all office hours meeting. And then we will have a meeting on January 4th. We are trying to get enough information to share about parsing LEA costs, but there's some questions there, so we put the topic as TBD, and we'll let you know as we get closer. But we are around and available to answer any questions if you like, and if you are done, you're welcome to log off. Either way, thanks for coming, everyone, and helping us muddle through all this